Welcome back to the channel. My name is Lucas, and today I hosted David Schindler. David is a professor of metaphysics and anthropology at John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C. He has written 11 books, including Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, one of my all-time favorite books. We discussed some of his book and many more things. I asked him many questions, and I told David this at the end of the episode that the time really flew by for me. It was an absolute joy speaking to him, and I hope you guys experience some of that as well. Please enjoy. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm joined by David Schindler. David, welcome to the channel.
Thank you for having me, Lucas.
I wanted to start, as I told you offline, with a bit more personal information, a bit more about your story. I'm always
Hmm.
curious about how my guests grew up, and then specifically if there are specific moments in your life that made you who you are today. Um, I'm a big fan of your work. I like how you combine Plato um, with also your Christian background. I try to do the same for myself. So yeah, that's just how I'll start, and I'll let you take it from there.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe I'll try to say a little bit about my background, how I came to those particular.
That's perfect.
My father was a theologian. First of all, I apologize to your readers here, or readers, your audience. I have a scratchy voice. I'm getting over a cold, but anyway, my father was a theologian, very serious, kind of a model philosopher for me.
Yeah.
Really uh, an example of somebody who um, followed the truth wherever it led him in a way that was always, I think, just surprising to people in general. He made a big impact on people and me in particular. I didn't grow up with him though. My parents were divorced, and I grew up mostly with my mother and stepfather. But moved back in with my father right as I was in a way, beginning an intellectual awakening of sorts in high school. And yeah, that was extremely formative. I would spend uh, um, hours in conversation with him discussing big ideas, and um, we would meet on Sundays for brunch and have a long drawn out conversation that would always end with a reading list, and then I would read things during the week and then we'd discuss them again. So that was a very big it had a very big influence on me. But it was in college that I should say the book that changed my life. And I initially thought that I wanted to be in follow the path of beauty. That was one of the things my father always said, that one of the determining characteristics of people. Some people say you have Platonists, you have Aristotelians, you have
Yeah.
those who love Bach, those who love Mozart, those kinds of things. Schiller and Goethe, as the Germans would say. Uh, my father said used to say that the transcendentals usually represented in a way a fundamental life's vocation. So one
Hmm.
of the basic questions a person would sort out is whether you devote your life to truth, to beauty, or to goodness, and those take very different forms. And I initially thought beauty. In a way, I found all three of them equally compelling. And I initially thought beauty, I wanted to be a painter or maybe do music, but it became clear at a certain point that that's not, I didn't have sufficient talent for that, even if I had a love for it. I was especially interested in the work of Vincent van Gogh. So your
Yes.
country, and I know that I'm not pronouncing his name properly, but
You want to try it?
Van Gogh,
Van Gogh.
Van Gogh, Van
Perfect.
Gogh.
That's it.
So, in fact, I did a little pilgrimage and saw where he was born,
Oh wow.
and so I was quite devoted to him. But at a certain point, I realized I actually liked his letters even more than his paintings, and
Mm.
that opened me up to this idea that um, of philosophy.
Yeah.
And it was around that time that I read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle
Oh
Maintenance, which
wow.
was
Pirsig.
really
Yeah.
a decisive moment for me. That's when when I read that, I just knew that philosophy was going to be a major part of my life for the rest
Wow.
for the long run. So, and I've reread that book many times. It's constantly compelling. But then uh, around that same time, I also had a kind of a reconversion to Christianity. I was looking for some convergence of all of these things, and it finally became apparent to me that it was the Christian God. Although I had trouble with the sort of personal dimension of that. I always thought
Uh-huh.
of the good was much more, in a way, compelling to me than God as a personal figure. So it took some time to understand the importance of
Mhm.
the personal, and then the significance of the incarnation, which really changes everything.
Can I ask
Um,
you how old you were when you converted or when you were in the process of conversion?
yeah, good question. Let's see. It was right before my senior year of high school.
Okay.
I would
Okay.
have been, yeah. So I was fairly young. Um, I guess. Depends on what you're
Everyone
comparing.
has their own journey, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but it was, it was a pretty radical thing. At first I thought that I needed to pursue a a kind of purely monastic. I cleared everything out of my room. I wanted a life of absolute simplicity. I slept on the floor, and we do these all night vigils and prayer and things. And
Uh,
after a while, I realized that I was it was a sort of a disordered reaction that in a way it was very much a reaction
yeah.
rather than a genuine vocation. But that took some time to sort out. But that all happened, yeah, right before my senior year of high school.
That's so interesting. I have a similar timeline, and
Oh,
I don't think as extreme, but for me it was when I was about 18, 19. Also,
hmm.
not exactly abstinence, but very disciplined. And
Yes,
I really tried to access God through different means.
right.
And also Pirsig for me was important. But funnily
Is
enough, I
it-
started with Lila and not with
Oh,
Art of
I
Motorcycling.
don't know that would have had the same. I was disappointed with Leela, I have to
Really?
say. I found that the first book so much more
Yeah,
compelling. But
yeah.
maybe maybe um uh it's at a certain standard. If I read it again now, maybe I'd have a different impression.
Maybe, yeah. For me, yeah, I have difficulty with that because I read Leela first. I have a bit of an emotional connection to that, and I'm sure you
Sure.
do the same the other way.
Yeah.
So it's difficult. Yeah. Well, that's great. And
Yeah.
then,
My I remember after I read the book and was so um transformed by it. It turned out, I mean, it was very funny. My father actually had a T-shirt, Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an old T-shirt that he never
uh,
wore. And I was constantly talking about the book, and he said, "Well, hey, I have something for you," and, and gave me a T-shirt, and that was like the most precious thing in my possession
yeah,
at the time.
yeah.
It's funny, a T-shirt.
Hmm. I was gonna say my father's also a theologian, and we also had the Sunday. I think
Oh,
less
well,
intense than you did, but for me, he helped me through the New Testament and really helped me get back to my Christianity. But
that's
yeah,
that's interesting. So we've got a lot of connections.
a lot of parallels. Yeah, that's great. Is there anything else you want to add to your personal story?
Oh, I mean, maybe things will come up, but
Okay,
just in
that's good.
terms of how I started on the path, maybe that's
Yeah,
enough.
perfect. So Pirsig, um, when you read him, did you feel like this is a thinker that I really resonate and agree with, or was it someone that more just sparked something in you?
Great question. What was it? I would say what I found so compelling was maybe more his modeling of the intellectual life and what it means to follow out a question all the way to the end.
Mm,
That I think that's what it was that really made an impression. So it was interesting. One of the points that he made that has stayed with me, and it's something I still think about these days, is how often um, one will be tempted, especially in a kind of reactionary way, to take the opposite of what's proposed. So you've got the thesis and antithesis, and
Hmm.
and um, inevitably, a thesis and antithesis of that sort, I mean, they get into a dialectical relationship.
Yes.
Inevitably, you're allowing the very problem that you want to try to respond to set the terms, and so you're going to be incorporating part of the problem into your solution. And it's always the case, if you have to go deeper to see where the two dialectical opposites share a basic presupposition. And if you can find that, that's really where the action is.
Yeah.
Now you've hit on something that's really important. And I think he, in his reaction to both romanticism and classicism, for instance, if I recall the terms correctly, I think those are the terms he used. Um, he didn't take a side. He tried to discover what it was that what they shared, and it eventually drove him to this fundamental question about quality,
Mm.
which I think in a way is a question he eventually associates that with arete, with excellence. I
Yes.
mean, and I think you could even connect that to beauty in a sense, the beautiful and the good, in the Platonic sense. Um, what is that, and why, and is it objective or subjective? Is it
Yes.
a matter of thought or a matter of feeling? All these things, he recognized that the opposites are always partial, and
Yeah.
it's deeper than the distinction.
Exactly. That's a brilliant point. For me, the most transformative thing about Pirsig's work is exactly that, escaping the framework of
Mhm.
subject-object metaphysics. And then I started to apply static and dynamic. And
Oh,
if you talk to my fiance about this, she will say that I'm really annoying about this because I use it in everything, apply it to every
yeah,
part of my life. I'm like, yeah, because I have a bit of static and dynamic, and I try to, let them work
yeah.
with each other. So
Yeah,
okay.
and you realize, when you go to the depths, that there's something dynamic in
Mm.
the static, and there's something static in the dynamic, and those things are
Exactly.
not simply opposites.
Yeah.
It's really crucial to see that.
Hmm.
And the thing that's interesting about that is it takes patience, and it takes a kind of, and this is one of the things about my father that made such an impression on me was, um, it requires a kind of devotion to the truth to be able to get beyond those
Yes.
oppositions.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have a student right now who's working on the French uh, poet thinker, Charles Péguy.
Hmm.
Do you know Charles Péguy?
I don't.
He's P-E accent aigu, G-U-Y.
Yeah.
He
Okay.
died in World War One, an early death. Really one of the most extraordinary figures in modern Catholic thought. But he is a representative of all of this too. He had an extraordinary integrity, and he used to make a distinction between mystique and politique, that things
Mm.
begin in mystique and end in politique. And I think what he means, one of the things he means by that is mystique is precisely, I mean, it's a curious word that he chooses, but I think it means precisely this um, entry into a more fundamental life-giving origin that precedes the opposed distinctions. And once you get to just the oppositions fighting back and forth, it becomes political.
Mm. Mm.
But that's an inadequate framing, and it's always a matter of getting back to the life-giving center.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also, I guess, trying to get there. This is a question actually. Can you get there by means of the opposition? For example,
Yeah.
words referring beyond words.
Hmm,
Is that
hmm.
possible? Or do you need to go?
Well, so it's kind of interesting. This would be an example of the kind of thing one would be tempted to say, okay, it's beyond words, and so um, it's non-conceptual, or it's non-linguistic, or non-verbal. And I think the truth is that, again, that to say just that is already to enter into a kind of a dualism, the verbal
Mm.
versus the
Mm.
non-verbal. It's a deeper truth, and if it is a deeper truth, it's both. capturable in words, but exceeds the very words that
Yes.
capture it. And sometimes, and the greatest poets use words in a way that transcends words. And
Yes.
Plato was the master at
Of
that.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There's a paradoxical nature seemingly to reality. And I also
Hmm.
see you speak about that in your book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason. Why do you think, is it by necessity paradoxical?
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. It's funny that you asked that because I wondered that myself. Is paradox just like it just happens to be the case that when you
Yeah.
get to more things, they start to look paradoxical, or is paradox somehow central and essential? And that's something I've always registered and put in the back of my mind. That's something one of these days I'm going to have to think about really seriously. But I suspect that it's more essential. It's not just an accidental feature, and why that should be the case, I'm not absolutely sure. There's something about beauty as the coincidence of opposites, um, and this sort of life-giving principle that generates that makes distinctions possible. That it can't. It's going to that's going to have to appear in a kind of paradoxical way.
Mm.
But I often think in this context, are you familiar with G.K. Chesterton? The G.K. Chesterton?
I've heard the name definitely, but I'm not familiar with the ideas.
Yeah, he's a British writer and one of the funniest, wittiest human beings I think in history. But he has a book called Orthodoxy, where he gives an account of he became Catholic at a certain point, and it's his attempt to explain why he became Catholic, given his background and things. But paradox lies at the very center of that. He
Ah,
constantly talks about paradox, and that it's a little book, and it's a very enjoyable read. I would
excellent.
highly recommend it to
I
you.
will put it in the description for the people
Okay.
listening. That sounds
Okay.
good. Okay, I'm going to pull up quickly a question. Um, is the good equivalent to God in your view?
Hmm. Right. Right.
Because Jonathan Pajot has argued for this recently. I'm not sure if it's an exact equivalence to
Yeah.
him, but
Yeah.
he tries to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So he's argued that they're equivalent. Is that what
I
you're
think
suggesting?
so. I think so. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Interesting. I would love to hear how he would formulate. He's somebody I admire very very much.
I will send you
Um.
the talk because he did a talk recently at a big event exactly about this. So
Okay.
that's that. So I will email that
Oh,
to you.
please. Okay. Please do. It seems to me that so one of my all-time favorite books, and this is something I only discovered in graduate school, as a matter of fact. I was late coming to it, but really is I think one of the greatest achievements of the human mind. I tell my students that is Dionysius the Areopagite.
Hmm.
He's often referred to as pseudo Dionysius because no
Yes.
one knows who he was. He
Uh-huh.
he he adopted the pseudonym, the pen name, and even that nobody's sure exactly why or what's behind all of that. He wrote around the fifth century, but in his book, The Divine Names, it's his main work. He presents so the divine names. He's trying to, in a way, bring philosophy and scripture together. That's
Mm.
and he wants to show that some of these basic themes in the tradition of philosophy. And at that point, there really was just the tradition, and it was Neoplatonic philosophy that had fully integrated Aristotle.
Mm.
That was the tradition. He wanted to show that the basic insights of that tradition um, uh, converged with Scripture.
Yes.
That they were sort of made for each other, and so he took names from Scripture and names of God, ways that God is described in Scripture, and showed how they connected to these Neoplatonic ideas. So he didn't do it in those terms. That this is my interpretation of what he's
Yes.
doing, but it's a pretty compelling argument or interpretation. In any event, he presents the good as the highest name of God.
Mm.
So it's a divine name. It's and in that sense, it's one of the best ways to interpret uh, who God is or what God is. And actually, that's an interesting way to put it. So, excuse me. One of the criticisms of Dionysius is that he seems to be more philosophical than scriptural or theological. And there's something to that. He does in the beginning talk about the Trinity, but he presents it as so mysterious. Um, he's not going to dwell on it. He makes some extraordinarily beautiful references, though, to the incarnation, and I mean, really stunningly beautiful things. But some people think that he loses precisely what we talked about at the beginning here is that the personal dimension of God.
Yeah.
And I think that God as person, as not only as the object of love and the inspirer of all love, but also a lover,
Mm. Yes.
is 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 something that you don't. At least it's not evident in the word good, in the name good.
Yes, that
Uh,
makes sense.
so I think I would say in one respect the good and God are identical in one respect. But I would also say that the name good doesn't capture everything that God is.
Yeah. That's a
And
great answer.
there's an infinite wealth,
Yeah.
especially when you begin to think about the meaning of the Trinity and the Trinitarian processions. I've been reading some dissertations lately on the theme and spending time in that mystery, and it really is quite extraordinary. The breadth and depth of
Mm.
meaning in the Trinitarian processions. That's not captured in the word good, but
No,
but I would still, the good is one of my favorite names for God. I mean, I think it's absolutely indispensable because I think. Sorry, I'm giving a very long answer to your
it's
question,
great. That's what I love. Please continue.
but if I think that if you separate the two too much and you think that and so this would be another example of the kind of dialectical opposition that people will fall into. They'll want to say no, God is not a what, God is a who.
Mm.
God is a person, he's not a a being. And that's not true. He's both a what and a who. I mean, there is a divine nature,
Yes.
and there is an essence of God and an ontological, to use the fancy word there, an ontological dimension to God that I think, if you remove the good from your theology, you miss, and there's a lot that comes with that. You lose the cosmological dimension of Christianity. You lose the ontological, the metaphysical. You lose. I mean, it becomes Christianity gets reduced to either pious practices or just morality or something.
Yes. So many questions pop up. I really hope I can remember. So, okay, I want to speak about Christ. Is he a symbol?
Mhm.
Is he something to look at or look through to
Yeah.
access more? How do I understand that? For me, so I call myself a Christian. I
Yes.
was raised Christian. I was raised Protestant. I got back to Christianity. Perhaps I'm not sure if I can go back to the Protestant tradition, but at least that's a bit of the background is where west to where I'm at. This is a Coptic cross
I
because
see.
this
Yes.
is my connection to Egypt. I feel
Okay.
like a personal relationship to God through Christ. But
Yes.
how would you describe Christ? What,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
is, yeah, how do I get to that?
Well, you asked if he's a symbol. I mean, uh, some people would say no, he's not a symbol. He's a reality, and part of the problem is, that opposes symbol and reality. I mean, he
Yes.
is a symbol and a reality, not only
Mhm.
a symbol. And to my mind, this is one of the concerns that I have with modern forms of Christianity that absolutize Christ as an individual.
Mhm.
and then make everything revolve around Christ. Now that's an understandable temptation because he's the Son of God. He's I mean, the incarnation of God. I mean, if you're going to absolutize something, probably the best thing that you can
Yeah,
possibly. But the fact of the matter is, and I find uh, extraordinary light shed on this by the theologian Urs von Balthasar. He's the one I wrote my dissertation on many years ago, but he he's got such a profound insight into, again, the Trinitarian nature of God, and you can't isolate Christ from the Father and from the Spirit. So that there's a certain sense in which the very essence of Christ is to point beyond himself. In a way to the Father, but back to the Father, forward to through the Spirit, in the Church and so forth, so that ultimately, and this is something that the Eastern Church, I think, understands better than the Catholic Church, more typically, that you speak of the cosmic Christ. I mean, the incarnation is eventually meant to include the whole universe and all of history, to be taken up into the body of Christ.
yeah,
So when you start thinking about it in those terms, it's very different from a kind of preoccupation simply with a positivistically understood historical individual or something like that.
yeah. Perfect. Thank you. I I've been very compelled by a thinker that I think you're familiar with, Wolfgang Smith. Uh,
Oh yeah.
yes, he came onto the internet very recently, and I devoured his ideas. I read most all of his books that I could find, and
Well.
yeah, I was really compelled by a lot of what he says. He himself is a Catholic as well, a
Hmm.
Platonist,
Hmm.
and he's also deeply connected to the Vedic tradition.
Okay.
And
Right.
that's something that I don't hear a lot of people speak about, but he would say that there's a different union with God in the East and the West. And he says that the
Hmm.
union in the East is more of a nirvana, so self
Yeah.
annihilation, and in the West, it is more of a relationship.
Hmm.
As far as
Yeah.
you can respond to this, would you agree with this conception?
I think so. It's funny. It's funny that you asked me in the beginning to talk about my upbringing. This is one of the first questions that I when I when I sort of had the conversion to Christianity, that I talked to my father about, is because I think initially I thought Buddhism, a kind of a total selflessness, was the answer, and we spent a
Mhm.
lot of time talking about precisely that, the difference between total self-emptying versus in Christianity, that the nuptial relation, um, the analogy of marriage is at the heart of the God world relation. So, as you say, a relationship, I think that's love that doesn't have a kind of reciprocity is not really love, and I think that that's something that tends to go missing in the East. Now, I always first of all, I should say, when I mentioned the East and the West, in my previous answer, I was talking about the Eastern Orthodox
Yes.
Church
Yes.
rather than Eastern religions.
Hmm.
So I didn't mean quite that, because and it would be interesting to hear what if Wolfgang Smith would have where he would place Eastern Orthodoxy with
Yes.
respect to the West and the East. It would be kind of interesting to hear.
Hmm.
Um, I have some friends who are uh, and some former colleagues who are very deeply into Eastern thought, and whenever I would start speaking of it, they would always tell me that I was mischaracterizing things. So I've learned to be very cautious. Um, but the way you described it uh, resonates with my
Yeah.
impressions.
Okay, good, good. Is there anything else about Wolfgang Smith's ideas that stood out to you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, in fact, I'm teaching a class right now on perception and imagination,
Ah, yeah.
which is a curious course in a theology PhD program. But I've become increasingly convinced of the importance of
Hmm.
these things, especially in our current culture. And we just this last class read James Gibson,
Yes.
uh, that I know Wolfgang Smith is very enthusiastic about.
Hmm.
And in fact, I may have first come across his name in Smith, but I've also heard John Vervaeke talk
Yes.
about and he's such an important figure. And there's a retired quantum physicist who's taking my class,
Oh,
and
wow.
I've uh, presented him with some things from Wolfgang Smith just to get his reaction, and he's not quite sure what to make of it. I mean, he does say that the details are all perfectly correct, but he's nervous, especially about the rejection of Einstein
Mm.
and the theory of relativity. He finds that really troubling.
Yeah.
He hasn't spelled it out yet. This is a conversation that's going to continue.
Good.
But the thing that both he and I affirm without qualification. Well, okay, I'm going to add a little qualification, but one of the things that I have found most helpful in Wolfgang Smith is his distinction between the corporeal and the physical.
Yes.
Um, and my qualification is I don't like that. I mean, when he says physical, he means quantum physics.
Mm.
And
Yes.
when I hear physical, I think of physis and natura. I mean, in a way, I mean, I would want to use the word physical for what he calls corporeal, and
Ah.
and call the physical like maybe the mathematical or something. I don't know, but
Okay.
in any event, the distinction is an absolutely crucial one, and it's especially interesting if you connect it to some ideas, for instance, in Goethe
Mm.
about the normativity of sense experience, that the human senses actually are not um, yeah, they're organs of perceptions of reality,
Yes.
and things that go beyond what the senses can see in a way are I mean, as Wolfgang Smith will put it, potential realities.
Mm.
They they occupy this, to use a kind of classical metaphysical language, the realm of potency rather than the realm of actuality.
Yes. Yes.
Potency is not only conceptual. Potency has a quasi reality, but it's
Mhm.
it's different from actual reality. And I mean, the idea that actuality is what we see with our senses, that's something that's worth thinking about a very, very long time. That changes everything.
Yeah.
And I think it's a sense of reality that we have lost typically
Mm. Yeah.
in the West and in the East. I mean,
Yeah.
this is you wouldn't present the Eastern thinkers as having saved the appearances,
No.
to use Owen Barfield's language.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. I wanted to speak a bit about the meaning crisis. John Vervaeke
Yes.
popularized this term, of course, and I know that you're familiar with John. He said to me in a conversation with him, he said that he asked you if you guys are friends, and then you said, "Well, if you haven't met each other in person, maybe that's too early to say." So I hope you do meet in person. That would be great.
Yeah. Yeah.
John is greatly inspired by your work.
Mm.
And so I was wondering what you think of this conception, the meaning crisis. Do you think it's an accurate term for what we're going through right now?
I mean, without any question, I think that's. In fact, is that how I first heard about John? I mean, a crisis. I mean, this is language that my father used to use all the
Yeah.
all um and as he would say, that there's nothing that a human being needs more than meaning. I mean,
Mm,
it's more important than food, and water. If we don't have our food and water in a meaningful way, um it's actually doesn't satisfy. And
yeah.
I teach at the John Paul II Institute. Pope John Paul II, in one of his encyclicals, said that, described the contemporary crisis as fundamentally a crisis of meaning. So this notion is something I think it's recognized all over.
Yeah.
One of the things that I admire about John Vervaeke is how systematically he has thought through. I mean,
Hmm.
as he does his inimitable way. I mean, when he thinks about things, he really sort of thinks them through.
Yes.
Um, and he has really spent a good bit of his life unfolding the significance of that,
Yeah.
and attempting, in a more than just theoretical way, but in a very practical way, in a very human sort of way. I mean, I'm struck always by how many people, that know him, that they I mean, they feel a personal devotion to him. It's never just, oh yeah, I'm familiar with his work. It's, there tends to be this sense of the person there, and I
Yeah.
think that's because his response to the meaning crisis is a life and not just thoughts.
Yeah. It's a devotion to something for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
I see in John a lot of wisdom. I
yeah.
of all the people I've spoken to online, offline in my life, with John, I
Hmm.
felt that he's really walking the walk, and
Yeah,
his practices really seem to do something for him. And he's very
yeah.
gracious, very intelligent, and yeah. I wanted to
You
ask you.
know,
Go ahead. Yeah.
what one of his ideas that I think about a lot. I mean, in a way, it's what struck me in Plato originally, but this idea that reason is inseparable from a concern, a care for reality.
Hmm.
That's a really important.
Can you expand on that?
Well, we tend. I think it was David Hume um, said somewhere that it's perfectly reasonable to prefer the scratching of my finger, the scratching of an itch on my finger, to the destruction of the entire
Mm.
universe. It's
Yes.
perfectly rational. But but if you look at it from a moral perspective, you see that it's wrong. And I want to say it's not rational, and you can't separate rationality from morality in that sort of simple way. And if you don't care about the good, you actually can't think properly
Yeah.
about things.
Yes. Yes. One thing you said in one of your books was that it's important to grasp things in the light of the good,
Yeah,
instead of apart from the good. Is there a way for us to do this? How do we do this?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm looking up at an icon here of Christ on the cross up above me. I think that the right now I'm working on a book on the nature of authority.
Mm.
And it's funny, this is an idea that's sort of imposed itself on me. It's never something I would have pursued
Yeah.
choice or by election, but it somehow has grown, and I've gotten to the point where I think it's really fundamental. And I realize even the book on Plato was really about authority. I didn't
Mm.
have that language then. I don't think I should go back and look to see if I used the word ever, but um, it seems to me that there has to be something of an authority and a tradition that an authority um, generates. Uh, yeah, that's a. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it gets sort of complex. But um, I think but there's a kind of an organic character to belonging to an authoritative tradition that I've come to realize is essential to being able to see things in the light of the good.
Yeah.
So it's not something, and see, this is one of the problems when I was in my room and tried to block out the world.
Yes.
That's not, you're not actually seeing reality in the light of the good there. In a way, you're trying to create your own light, and it's impossible to receive the light of the good except as mediated through reality,
Mm.
and that means also through a community that one is a part of, and so forth. I mean, these things become, ever increasingly comprehensive. And ultimately, I would say the church is the most. I mean, if you think of the aiming for the cosmic Christ, I mean, the church in that sort of cosmic sense, I think, is the ultimate organic tradition that allows us to see in the light of the good.
Wow. So would you then
That's
say also?
a mystical answer to your question, but
No, it's great. It's beautiful. The mystical answers are the best answers, in my opinion.
okay.
Would you then say that to answer the meaning crisis, at least for us in the West, would be to return to the church?
Yeah, yes, I think that has to be the case. But
Okay.
what exactly does that mean, and what would that mean? I mean, the it has to be returned to the church, but always through reality and through the givenness of the reality of our world and each of our particular situations. So, it can't become a sort of what would you call it? Kind of an idealistic politics or something. That can be very dangerous.
Yeah.
It has to grow organically, but it really does have to be an organic growth back to the tradition that I mean is ours. Now, how when I say ours, obviously in a very obvious way, I mean sort of the Western tradition. But you study Egyptology. Where does well, I mean, Egypt is an interesting case, but I mean, where does the broader kind of Eastern, the whole globe, the Chinese and so forth, where
Yes.
do they fit in the Christian story? I you know for two things to say to that. One is I think that they do fit, uh, but I also think that you need somebody that I'm not the person to explain how or why. And that you need somebody who's actually inside of those sorts of traditions. I actually had a Chinese student, write on this question for a dissertation. She uncovered. It was very eye opening for me. Um, but you realize, she was absolutely devoted to traditional Chinese culture and totally given over to her Christian faith. She had converted to Christianity and then to Catholicism, and thought that they belonged together. And I mean, wait, you could say she's a living proof. But in terms of as a general principle, I don't see any other way.
Oh, wow. So how do you view the practices and I guess the movement that John is trying to popularize? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be a great question for him.
Mhm.
I don't know enough about the details of his um um where he takes things.
Yes.
But that's an aspect of his thought that I haven't had a chance to explore. But the one thing that I would say, and I think this is actually a very important principle, is that I trust him.
Mm.
And I mean, that in a way, that he's you can tell by the combination of goodness and intelligence that he's taking it somewhere very fruitful, and
Yes.
that there's kind of a purity of heart.
Yes.
And so one can be confident that wherever it goes, it's going to bear some fruit. Um, but and that's helpful to say that, because that was sort of what I was trying to say a bit abstractly a moment ago. I don't think you can judge things so much from the outside. These aren't like abstract ideas that are measuring our reality. That truth is inevitably real, and so it can only ever be found in and through reality.
Yes.
And if to the extent that the pursuit of truth takes you away from reality, it does raise suspicions, and potentially pose some dangers, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do think that John, through his practices, gets closer to truth and goodness,
Mhm.
clearly. Um, And I've never seen a good person that is not beautiful. So that's
Yeah,
always a good sign
yeah,
as well.
yeah, that's right.
One of my favorite quotes from your book is the following: perfect freedom is thus identical to absolute obedience to what is absolute. Can you expand on this quote?
Yeah. I always get nervous when people quote me. I think, oh no, will I hear something that I could still defend? But I think I would still defend that. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean that's the thing. So, um, you can't help but in everything that we think and do, we presuppose we rest on basic presuppositions about the nature of reality, and that ultimately is tied to what we take to be ultimate. So there's something that is posited, whether implicitly or explicitly, and mostly implicitly, and maybe even ultimately always in some respect implicitly by its nature. Um, we something is sort of acknowledged as ultimate and therefore as absolute, to which everything else is relative. Now, if that's inevitable, then the question is, it's never, whether or not you're absolutizing something. It's just what you're absolutizing.
Mm,
And, this is something that St. Augustine is really good about, a very profound theme in his thought, the theme of idolatry.
mm.
We, we can't help but love something ultimately. And so whatever that ultimate thing is, we effectively treat it as God. And then the basic question is, if it's not God, then it's going to disorder reality for
Yes.
you and create, you cycles of addiction
Yeah.
and obsession and fragmentation and so forth. And the only way to avoid that is by absolutizing what is in fact absolute.
Ah, that's brilliant. Actually, I spoke about this exactly 2, 3 days ago. I
Okay,
feel like because someone asked me this question and I use different words, but I feel like we're getting at the same thing. So
good, good.
that
Yeah.
means I'm not completely wandering in the wilderness.
Well, I mean, and think about it. It's one of these things that, I mean, it's almost tautological.
Yes.
In fact, it sort
Yes.
of is tautological. I mean, it's one of these things you see it. It can't but be true. It
Mm,
has to be true
it
that if
does.
you absolutize what is less than absolute, all of the relative things are going to be disordered. And the only way to actually do full justice to everything is by ordering them in relation to what is in fact ultimate.
Yes. I cannot explain where interests come from. And in my case, part of that is Egypt, like I told you. So I've asked multiple people this before. What do you think gods are in Egypt or perhaps also in Greece? I mean, you're familiar with Plato, so then it's also speaking about gods. How would you describe gods?
Yeah, yeah. It's I don't know yet. This is something I'd like to think about some more. At one point I spent a good bit of time studying Schelling because I thought that he was going to answer a lot of
Hmm.
my questions, and I I found it generally frustrating. Every time it seemed like he was opening things up, it went in a different direction. But I've been thinking about him again lately, because he's got a very interesting interpretation of that of gods. I mean, um, for him it has to do with, in a way, a kind of evolution of consciousness, and I think there's a truth to that. Um, I mean, even Scripture in the Old Testament speaks about the gods. Even the monotheism is not in a modern sort of simplistic form. So, clearly there are spiritual realities.
Yeah.
Uh, I mentioned Dionysius the Areopagite earlier. He's a representative of this great tradition of the hierarchy of angels, the celestial hierarchy, and the ancient world thought of human beings as, in a way, um, we were the center of the cosmos, but not because we were the highest. In fact, we're actually quite low in the totem pole.
Yes.
There
Yes.
are many more hierarchies above us than below us.
Yeah. We see
Um,
them below us, but
yeah, that's right. We don't see the ones above. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of room for and probably I suspect this is something we're going to be seeing more and more in the future, a kind of a more serious reckoning with this, both the angelic and the demonic, and
yeah.
um, and where the gods of the uh, sort of pre-Christian religions that were not, rejections of the Christian God in any obvious way, where they would stand. But yeah, I'm just sort of dancing around the
No,
point
it's
because I
great.
I don't
It,
have a full answer.
it already helps me to just conceptualize the idea that there is room for more above us, because then
Yeah,
that
yeah,
already really helps me understand. Um, do you have specific spiritual experience that inform your thinking, or is it mostly based on what you have read and then you feel that it resonates?
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, that's a tough question. I it, thinking is spiritual experience for me.
See this, I misframed the question.
Yeah,
That's what happened.
yeah. No, there is something because I used to and one has to be careful because one can over intellectualize spiritual realities. But it is the case that the mind is one of the um, most fertile organs of spiritual perception. In fact, it is. Well, the heart, and I mean, but the mind is certainly part of the highest, uh, dimension of the human being. And so, if we're going to have spiritual experiences, they're going to pass through the mind somehow. And if they circumvent the mind, that's probably a bad sign. Yeah, so okay, but all that being said, I mean there is something to be said for the more existential encounter with the realities,
Yeah.
rather which is distinct from the kind of distance one has in writing about them. And um, I um, yeah, I don't know that I'm just going to leave it at that. I think
Perfect. That's great. That's great.
okay.
You did say that about writing,
Hmm,
um, that philosophy perhaps requires an intrinsic need for writing.
hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry to pull up the quotes, but I want to
Yeah,
make
no, no, it's helpful. It's helpful. I think I was trying to make sense of this paradox in Plato about his disparaging of writing and yet his being one of the greatest writers of all
yes,
time.
yes.
And people see that as, they laugh at the contradiction there, but I think that Plato was fully aware of that. And
Mhm.
I argue there in the book that his awareness is one of the things that gives his writing so much power, actually.
Yes, yes.
But I think it's there's a long tradition of contemplation that bears fruit. And if one genuinely receives insight, that insight demands expression.
Yes,
Um,
okay.
it really it sort of imposes a kind of a need to give birth in words in one way. There are other ways to give birth to be fruitful
Mm-hmm.
in philosophical insight. But I will say, it's not the case that you have the insight and then you just write what you already thought. There's something in the very act of writing, you're actually discovering the thought for the first time
Yes,
properly.
that makes sense. As you touch upon reality, reality reveals more.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's right.
David, I want to be respectful of your time. We're nearing the end. It has been an absolute joy to speak to you. It flew by for me. Uh,
Yes, it did me too. And I'm glad to have met you. And
yeah,
I wish you luck with your engagement, as you mentioned,
thank you.
and your study of Egyptology,
Thank you.
and your projects there,
My little projects.
your little
Keep working
projects.
on
Yeah,
them. And you,
they
good
seem
luck
to
with
be
authority.
more than little projects, but yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. I wish you a good rest of your day, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I don't take it for granted. Thank you. Have a good day.